What if we put Christianity on trial? What would that look like? What kind of courtroom scene would that be? What if you, make it more personal, what if you were the one given the responsibility to stand and, in a way, be the defense attorney for Christianity? Or it might be that it's even more personal in that you're not so distanced. It's that if you're a Christian, you are on trial, or I am on trial. What would you say? How would you explain Christianity? How would you support, or to use that term again, defend Christianity? If we put Christianity on trial this evening, how would you go about explaining and defending Christianity? In this last section of the book of Acts, Acts 22 through 26, the Apostle Paul is on trial. He's arrested because of a mob that's about to start. He comes into Roman hands, Roman authorities. And then there's a series of discussions and speeches. He first stands before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, even though he's in Roman authority, but it's a Jewish matter. And so he's the first, if you will, the first trial is before the Jewish council. And then there's a couple of Roman governors that come in. And this happens over a 2-year period that Paul is imprisoned in Caesarea. And then eventually, Acts 27 and 28 is when he makes his journey. 27 is the shipwreck. And then he arrives in Rome to appear before Caesar himself in Acts 28. But you can look at this section here where Paul is on trial before the Jewish authorities and Roman officials as a kind of case study for Christianity on trial. As Paul stands to defend his own actions, to defend himself, he's really defending the truth about Jesus, or he's defending Christianity. Now, much of what you find in this section that Paul says, you will find earlier in the book of Acts. You'll find some of it in Peter's speeches. You'll find it in Paul's speeches as he goes on his missionary journeys. You'll find it in a similar setting at times. Take Corinth in Acts 18 when Paul is brought before a Roman official then. He doesn't really get his chance to make a case before a Roman authority then and there. But in a way, things build. And I don't know that things are as summarized or as highlighted, and I know I reversed those two and just now verbally, but the idea is still there. I don't know that you see that as much as right here. Or to put it another way, I don't know that there's anywhere else, at least in the book of Acts, where Christianity, its reality, its truth is as summarized and highlighted as we find in the Apostle Paul's defenses in these series of times when he's put on the stand, as it were. Now, it's also possible, there's some scholars that think, okay, and then, we can't prove this because the book of Acts never says it, and there's not any verification for it. But as you look at the book of Acts, it's at least possible that this book was originally, yes, inspired through Luke as a court document. As like, here's item A in the evidence for the Apostle Paul. Luke is with Paul. He joins him midway through the book of Acts. It's possible that Acts was originally a courtroom evidential document. Or, at least, these last few chapters are written as a record of here's what was said against Paul, here's what the Roman authorities were saying about Paul, usually very positive. And then here's what Paul said when he was given opportunity to defend himself. One more word of overall thought is that you have Paul retelling his conversion account 2 times in these chapters. He tells it in chapter 22 and he tells it again in chapter 26. All total, how many times is that in the book of Acts? That's 3. It's almost as if Luke as if the Holy Spirit wants us to really get Paul and his conversion and what that meant for that time, for the leader of the Jewish persecution, the man that held Stephen's, or the man that held the coats for those that stoned Stephen, for him to become not just a Christian, but to become one now that is on stand defending Christianity. There's something about that we're meant to, it's almost as if Luke believes in repetition. Now, and they're not verbatim. You get different nuances and some different supplemental information each time. But they're the same basic account of Paul's conversion, a case study. As we, in a way, put Christianity on trial, here's 3 ways of thinking about that process. That one, Christianity is supported by the Scriptures. Supported, in this case, by the first portion of our Bibles, by the law and the prophets. Now, you could throw in the Psalms in there, and then you have the 3 parts of their Bible, but usually it's abbreviated to the law and the prophets. And that's how Paul does it in this section. And then that Christianity is grounded in historical matters. It's grounded in logical and historical truths. It's not myths or mere emotional appeal. There's something real here. And then lastly, that Christianity is defined by both the power and the controversy of the resurrection. Resurrection. So let's begin then with Christianity that is supported by the law and the prophets. Sometimes, even today in our world, when Christianity is discussed, it is viewed as a singular teaching. It is viewed almost as if it is one volume, and there's just one volume in the series. But in reality, Christianity comes on the scene as like the long-awaited sequel to the earlier series, if we're putting this in the idea here of a book series. So, on the other hand, for Paul and those in his day, it was like they had the first series of books and they'd been waiting on. It's like when people get interested in a novel series today, and I'm not saying that this is a novel, okay? But when people get interested in a novel series that's still being written, and they read the first 3, let's say, out of what they know are going to be 4 books, and then the writer decides, I'm not going to finish the story. Or the writer dies, and then you never know the rest of the story. But the good part is that Paul, as he stands in trial, says, I found the rest of the story. I found the sequel, the long-awaited part. And those who reject Christianity are like the people that say, I don't want to know how the story ends. I'm good with 3 out of 4. It's supported by the law and the prophets. That's why we say, to put it in a statement, that Christianity did not occur in a religious vacuum. Now, my wife observed the word vacuum as I was putting the finishing touches on my PowerPoint this afternoon, and so she asked, are you going to be talking about vacuums tonight? Well, not really, a different kind of vacuum. The more you would think about it as the scientific vacuum this evening, but here in a religious sense. But it's not like Jesus and the idea of Christianity just showed up out of nowhere. There was quite a bit of history and changes and conflicts and scripture that was written and given that leads up to the long-awaited Jesus. So let's begin this evening our reading of this section in Luke. It's written by Luke, okay? Y'all going to have to help me this evening. Keep me straight. In Acts 24, verse 14. Acts 24, verse 14. By this time, the phrase "the way" has become fairly common, it seems. As you read through the book of Acts, this had become a common way of both positively and negatively describing this movement. It wasn't known as Christianity yet. It was commonly known as the way. It was negatively referred to as the way, as a mere sect of the Jews. one that many of the Jews were saying was a heretical sect. It's a little path, a little way that's wandered away from the proper way. But here, the Apostle Paul uses it in a positive sense to say, this is not merely some sect of the Jews. It's not a bypass or a detour. It is the way. It's the main way all along. Look at Acts 24, verse 14. He says, but this I confess to you. He's on the stand making his confession now. That according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. Paul has been accused of denying the law, of blaspheming the temple. And he stands here and says, everything I believe, everything I'm doing that's led me to this point, yes, in context, in following the way, in following Jesus of Nazareth, is because I also believe everything in the law and the prophets all along. Now, there were some things that were changing and had changed. There was some recognition that certain things in the past were temporary in God's perspective. But when Paul is converted on the road to Damascus, it is not that in a sense, that he goes from this religion over here and then he goes to a totally different, new religion. It's more that there's a continuity here, Paul's saying. Yeah, some things change, and I saw some things differently or really clearer. But my stance in the law and the prophets, if we put it in our language today, it might be him saying, your Bible is the reason I'm doing and saying as I am. He says, this is the roots, it's the background to everything that I do. Now hold your place in Acts 24 and go with me for a moment to Acts 26. Now Paul stands before another Roman governor. Acts 24, he's standing before Festus. Now a couple of years later, Felix has replaced him. And so in Acts 26, he also is addressing King Agrippa, who showed up in pomp and circumstance, the king of Judea. You've got a Roman governor, a somewhat Jewish king. And here's how Paul describes both his knowledge and his passion of the Jewish faith. Look at verses 4 and 5, for example. He says, my manner of life from my youth, spent from the beginning among my own nation and in Jerusalem, is known by all the Jews. He goes on to say, they have known for a long time, if they're willing to testify. Might we say here that Paul himself was not some new figure on the scene in Jerusalem and Judea. He's been around. He's the guy that grew up learning at the feet of Gamaliel, the famous Jewish rabbi. He says, if they're willing to testify that according to the strictest party of our religion, I have lived as a Pharisee. Paul knew the Scriptures, knew the Jewish religion as well as, if not better than just about anybody in his day. He would say in Galatians 1 that he had arisen above all of his contemporaries in the Jewish faith. And so Paul is not some guy that really didn't know about the history of Israel and didn't really know the law and the prophets that well. It's more the other way around. And look at his passion, even before his conversion. Look at 9 through 11, when he remembers his actions. Verse 9, I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. So the very reason I'm on trial today, I was on the other side, extremely so. And I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priest, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. We don't know that Paul ever directly executed Christians, but here, by his own words, he did about as close as you can get. He might not have been the one always throwing the stones. Say in Stephen's example, he's holding the coats, but he's right there. And it may have been a time when an informal counsel is taken, and he casts his vote. He puts in for them to be killed. And then he says this, I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme, and in raging fury against them. The last part of verse 11, them I persecuted them even to foreign cities. And then verse 12 picks up with, it was in connection with this task that I was on my way to Damascus when something happened that changed Paul's life completely. But his point right here is about his background. But as we said earlier, it's not really just about Paul. It's also then realizing that this thing we call Christianity developed out of as an outgrowth of the promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the promises of change and God making things right that are throughout the Psalms, to the echoes of a king and a priest who will be perfect and will not have the failures of those they experienced from David onward. Well, really from Saul onward, we could say, but David was at least better in most ways. So when Paul stands up here on defense, he says, I'm still serving the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What's changed is I've realized that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look at one more verse on this one. Here's the bottom line. The bottom line is in Acts chapter 26, verses 19 through 23. This is after he has received his instructions from Jesus to go and take the message of Jesus to both Jew and non-Jew. And so in verse 19, he once again directly appeals to King Agrippa. And there's a reason for this, and we'll get there in a moment. But he does, throughout this speech, it's like King Agrippa is the only other person in the courtroom. It's just you and me. He says this in verse 19, Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and also to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds in keeping with their repentance. For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. To this day, I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying, both to the small and the great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. That's Paul's bottom line, is that's why I'm standing here. Is I'm following and believing and holding on to the real faith that even goes back to Abraham. Now, here's something additional to think about. Not only did Christianity not pop up in some religious vacuum as a totally new movement, but a new phase of a very old one in reality, we might even be careful how we think about it. Now, I'm going to be careful here because I don't want you going out tonight saying, well, Gantt said we shouldn't talk about Christianity. Okay? I included it in my title, so I'd be a hypocrite or a hypocrite, as we learned a few months back. But here's a way of approaching this. Here's a challenge for you. Find the word Christianity anywhere in these 66 documents. Find it. You'll find the word Christian 3 times, and that's about it. That's as close as you'll get. Over the centuries, we've developed this idea that, well, here's Christianity, its own religion, and then here's Judaism, its own religion, and then, well, there's a lot of other religions, movements, and groups out there. Now, to also be clear, the modern form of Judaism, well, that's a whole other ballgame. But we might think about it this way, that in the Bible, what we call Christianity is God's people, God's movement through Jesus. It is the true religion. It's just religion from God. And then over the centuries, we found a way to put a nomiker on it and call it Christianity. Now, here's one interesting example of this. I've recently had some discussions with someone from the Islamic religion. And they sent me a video, and it's a man, an Islamic speaker, and he's using this to argue against Christianity. He says Christianity and Judaism, they're not even in the Bible. And so the fun part there is I agree with his premise. The problem is where his conclusions go, right? And so when you think about Christianity, you put it on trial and you realize it's not Christianity standing on its own. There's a larger picture here. You've got 39 documents in the Old Testament that lead you to, if you will, Matthew, to Christianity, supported by the law and the prophets. And then secondly this evening, and this one's kind of the in-between, but also kind of throughout the whole trial of Paul, even though we're going to look at one passage. It's that it's grounded in historical reality. A couple of centuries ago, a man remarked that Jesus and the Bible are a lot like a lion. How many of you think you need to defend a lion? Anybody? Okay, we got two over here. I don't see anybody else. Not even the guys in the sound booth are going to take me up on this one. What do you do with a lion? They went on to say, with a lion, you don't have to defend a lion. You just, if let's say he's caged up, you unlock the cage and you let him go. And he'll take care of the rest. That's one way also of thinking about defending. That's part of why earlier I said, in a way, we say defending Christianity. Because most of what you do when you defend Christianity is open the cage and let Jesus and the Bible and the evidences that support and verify the credibility of the Bible, of this movement we call Christianity, it's like opening up the lion's cage and let him free, and he'll take care of it. It's possible that sometimes our mindset is a bit upside down, and that I've got to defend Jesus and the Bible from the attacks of the skeptics. And it's more about exposing what's already there. Think about the way Paul says this in Acts chapter 24, that this was not done in secrecy. Or in Acts 26, I said 24. I meant 26, verse 24. Okay, we were at verse 23 just a moment ago in Acts 26. Look at verse 24 now. He once again directs his attention to Agrippa, but before he does that, there's a loud interruption. The Roman governor, and I believe I may have swapped those earlier. I think I said Festus, then Felix. I got that backwards in my head for a bit. But in verse 24, Luke records that as he was saying these things in his defense, what we just read about, I'm just doing what the law and the prophets and Moses said, and that's why they seized me. Yet they claim to be the Jews who follow Moses, ironically. So as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, or the language here is something like, he shouted at the top of his lungs. Probably a little embarrassing, but it's like he's so overwhelmed, he just can't help it. He's a Roman. He doesn't know any of this Jewish background stuff. All he knows is it sounds like this guy's lost it. And so he shouts, Paul, you are out of your mind. You're crazy. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. But then again, what else can you really say? When Paul, the apostle, in this context, using some of his language, the scholar makes his defense, what else can you say? But you've just been studying too much. That's your problem. And it's driven you crazy. But look at Paul's response. Paul says, I am not out of my mind. Most excellent Festus. Now, a small side note here, sidebar. Aren't you kind of impressed with Paul? He's defending himself potentially from execution. He realizes that. He makes references in his trials to the fact that if I had done something worthy of death, that'd be one thing. He knows he's made his appeal to Caesar, and now the Roman governor interrupts him this way. And he still even calls him most excellent. And then he says, but I am speaking true and rational words. Or even I'm speaking like an orator would speak, using truth and logic. I'm reasoning with you about my conversion, about Jesus and the evidences for him. He says, for the king, now referring to Agrippa, he says the king knows about these things. You may not know about them. You haven't even been around during this time. Agrippa's been here. Agrippa has a background in both the Jewish culture and Jewish religion and pagan and Roman things. He's trying to straddle the fence of both, and you'll see more of that as we keep reading. But he says the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. Here's the reason why I keep calling him out, because he knows about it. And then this last line, he says, for I am persuaded that none of these things, Jesus' life, the lead up to Jesus, his death, his resurrection, none of these things, and what's happened since then as far as the church and its growth and the gospel spreading and Paul, none of these things, he says, have escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. If we put Christianity on trial, one of the things we realize is that Christianity is like an open book. It's not that it began in secrecy, hidden away in some cave, or someone claimed to have this hidden knowledge they discovered. It is based in historical, public events. And in that way, it welcomes those that would bring their questions, would bring even their critiques and their accusations. Christianity is built on the idea of both eyewitnesses, and here we might bring in for some comparison Peter's words in 2 Peter 1. It's based on the principle of a historian like Luke, who wasn't an eyewitness of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but he writes even his sequel, or his prequel, there we go, his prequel with that approach, the historian's mind. And even over the years, other historians, non-inspired historians, but historians nonetheless, have taken the gospel accounts, have taken the book of Acts and beyond, and tested its historical credibility. Or if you want to get really fancy, it's historicity. And now, if you didn't know that word, you can go this week and say, all right, I know about Christianity and its historicity. And then you sound like you're talking about a medical procedure, and maybe you shouldn't do that, okay? All right, let's just dismiss that one. But Christianity is based in real events. It's not something that just simply makes claims or says, well, this is what we believe as Christians. It's a movement that started because of a historical figure named Jesus. And then you could roll all this together and then say you've got the history of God and Israel that builds up to that figure named Jesus. Christianity on trial is supported by the law and the prophets. If we were in our trial, there's item A. Item B, it is grounded in public, historical, and logical things or truths. You can reason through, here's what I see, here's what happened, and here's my persuaded conclusion. Now here's the third one for the evening. It's about resurrection. We already saw that in Acts 26, verse 23. But here I'm thinking about the Columbus effect. Anybody know what the Columbus effect is? I say that based on the story of when Columbus had returned from, well, they don't call it discovering America anymore, but you know what I'm talking about, all right? From his big trip across, well, what was supposed to be around the world, and he comes back and there's a meeting of Spaniard officials in the royal palace, and they're all sitting around this big table, and he begins to overhear their conversation about him and his recent journey, and it's along the lines of, big deal. Anybody could have done that. All he did was get a bunch of ships and sail in one direction for a long time, and anybody could have done that. And so, he takes an egg, and he passes it around. And he challenges them to make the egg stand upright on the table. And they all play with the egg, and of course, nobody makes it stand on end. Once everybody has tried and has successfully failed, he then pulls out a boiled egg and he cuts off the bottom of the egg, puts it upright on the table. And supposedly he made this remark that once someone has done something, then it becomes easy for anybody else to do. In a similar and yet far greater impactful way, that's the resurrection of Jesus. Not just for Christianity, but for the world. Because Jesus isn't even the first person to be raised from the dead. He raised people from the dead before his death. But he's the first person to be raised from the dead to never what? To never die again. So that Christianity is not just a set of ideas. It's not just a set of beliefs, because it's also historical. It's not just even a set of ideas based in historical events. It is about the resurrection. And yes, how it was predicted by the law and the prophets. Go back to the first idea. How it also is at the heart of the historical evidence for Christianity. I mean, if you can take someone and show them, here's the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, then the rest of Christianity becomes somewhat easy after that point. Look at how Paul does it. Go back for a moment to Acts 23. Acts 23 for just a moment. This is his first defense. There's an incident that happens in the first 5 verses. I'll let you read that on your own sometime. But Paul picks up on something. That his audience, let's say the courtroom audience, is a bit divided. And so he says this in Acts 23, verse 6, here's the charge. No one had given an actual charge against Paul. And you never really find one. I mean, there's some lies that are told later, but there's never really a formal charge. That's part of why the Roman officials later say that we would have let him go if he had not appealed himself to Caesar. But here, Paul makes his own charge. Here's the charge against me. It says that when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council. Remember, this is when he's before the Sanhedrin. Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. He kind of gets a little political within their social, religious politics. And then, though, he says, it is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And then in 7 through 10, you see the response. It creates a problem. And even some of those among the Pharisees begin to wonder, whose side are we on? The Sadducees didn't believe in any kind of resurrection. Go back even to Acts chapter 4 when the Sadducees are upset because they're preaching resurrection, especially they're preaching the idea that the resurrection has already started with Jesus. And it appears that the Pharisees hold to what was the main line, the mainstream belief among Jews in the first century. That most everybody except the few Sadducees believed in the resurrection to come. Think about Jesus when he shows up when Lazarus is dead. Mary and Martha assume that they're going to see their brother again, they say, in the resurrection to come. Paul says, that's why I'm on trial. It's about the power of the resurrection that changes everything. Because God's new world is here. And it started with Jesus. That's the issue. It's this hope, he says. And he'll say that 2 more times. He'll say it again in Acts 24, Acts 26, that this is the reason I'm on trial. For this hope. The hope that Israel has been holding on to. That the brokenness and the sin, the power of Satan, one day would be broken. And that started when Jesus stepped out of that empty tomb. So that when you get to the end of Acts 26, we have the loud interruption, and Paul answers that. And now he puts Agrippa on the spot. Look at Acts 26. Now picking up in verse 27. I refer back to 23 because of what he has said about this resurrection hope that was in the law and the prophets all along. And then, after he says, I know these things haven't escaped Agrippa's notice, they weren't done in a corner. Verse 27 is when he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Now, what do? It's like when Jesus asked the Jewish leaders that came to him about John's immersion from heaven or from men. What do you do? Because if Agrippa says, no, I don't believe the prophets, he loses all of what one person called his Jewish street cred here is gone forever. But if he says yes, Paul has him on the hook. Now, I think usually, especially when you're not discussing with someone like Agrippa, you might reverse this. You might start with the resurrection of Jesus and then to our resurrection. But for Agrippa, because Paul has him on the spot here with the prophets, he starts with the prophets and their ideas about resurrection to Jesus. He says, I know that you believe. And that's when Agrippa says to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? Or you might have an English text tonight that has a bit of a more positive take on Agrippa, that he says, you almost persuade me. But given the overall context here, it might be more likely that it's not quite as positive for Agrippa. That he's embarrassed by being on the spot, and he finds a way to wiggle out of Paul's question and say, do you really think that's all it's going to take, Paul? That right now, right here, while you're on trial, and you put me on the spot, you think I'm just going to become a Christian. It's hard to snap your fingers when you're holding a remote. And then Paul looks down. Well, he looks back at Agrippa, and then he looks down. Look at that last part. Paul says in verse 29, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am. And then he looks down at his shackles and his chains and says, except for the chains part, I wouldn't wish that on you. But it is the resurrection, based here for Agrippa in the prophet's message, that is the dividing line for Christianity. You either dismiss the resurrection of Jesus, perhaps like what may be Agrippa here, you delay a decision. I'm just going to think about it, and I got to keep studying on it. And there's a place for that, but that only goes so far, so long, right? Or, when faced with the resurrection of Jesus, you accept it, and then your life, like Paul's, will never be the same. That's what happens when we put Christianity on trial. A movement supported by the law and the prophets, a movement that is grounded in historical and logical truths. We're not asking anybody to just believe some myths or made-up things based on emotion or whim, but something deeper and more solid than that. Because it all comes down to the power and the controversy. Just like Columbus discovering America changed the world and was pretty controversial. What did we say a minute ago? You take it up 100 degrees higher, and the empty tomb, the resurrected Lord, changes the world now and for the future, but also becomes the point of controversy even to this day. Now, in Acts 26, verse 18, Paul reviews or outlines his mission. He tells of how he was sent to open the eyes of the Gentiles. That's what Christianity does when we follow it. It eliminates our spiritual blindness. And then he says to take them from the power of Satan and bring them to the forgiveness of sin, our greatest problem removed, and to give us an inheritance, the promise received of life now and life to come. The long-awaited promises of the coming one and God's people receiving the inheritance all comes together in Christianity. So that as Christians, our responsibility becomes not that all that different than the Apostle Paul. What is it that his co-worker, his co-apostle will say in 1 Peter? 1 Peter 3, verse 15, he writes to regular, everyday Christians. He doesn't say you have to become an expert in apologetics or you have to become like the Apostle Paul in every way. But he does say, be ready to give an answer, be ready to give a defense for the hope that lies within you, with meekness and reverence. 1 Peter 3, verse 15. So Christianity goes on trial. Or it may be that, like the Apostle Paul, we are on trial. When asked about our hope, are we ready? Are we prepared to give a defense for the hope within us? We're going to sing this song that encourages one to obey that hope. Why do we say that? Because here's the answer. At the end of the day, when somebody says, what's this hope you have? How can you go through your struggles and still be who you are? For one example, people ask that. You say, well, I've got hope. And what's that hope? Might we then be the people who say, my hope died and rose again. My hope has a name. Let's stand and sing together.